Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Reinsurance Podcast. I am your co-host, Jerad Lee.
And I'm Ben Rose. How are you doing, Jerad?
I'm very, very well. We have a special guest today, again in the studio, the one, the only, chairman now of InsTech, formerly InsTech London, Robin Merttens. Welcome, sir.
Well, thank you very much. I'm expecting a whole new kind of respect that
Yeah.
now I've got the chairman title.
It's certainly warranted.
Yeah, Jared's going to have to wear a collared shirt.
Yeah, exactly. Should have dressed up for the occasion. But Robin, you sort of have been, for those in London, like a staple of sort of the innovation space for ages. I know when Ben and I first started looking at like the future of insurance and this InsTech movement, you were one of the first people we sort of landed on and started going to your sort of monthly events with everybody. So very much someone who's from your career in the industry then sort of left going, where does this, how is technology going to transform where we go next? But I'd love to sort of dive into a bit of your career and then what sort of drew you into the technology sphere of insurance, and we can go from there.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the kind words about InsTech. I mean that we'll come back to, but I'm doing that by accident, not by design. There's nothing else left for me to do. But by my first foray into technology, when I knew remarkably little about it, was age 40, when a friend of mine, Alex Letts, came along and said, "I've raised a lot of money. I'm going to build Lloyd's, and I know about technology. Do you want to come and be Mr. Insurance part of it?" And I was pretty unhappy where I was. So that was once I worked out how much money he'd raised, that was a no-brainer decision. And although it wasn't 10 million pounds in the bank, it was a line slip for effectively that amount of money, which in 2000 was well worth giving up your existing career and taking a risk with. And then we came from there. I mean, it seems mad now that we would talk about Lloyd's, but then it was a very, very groundbreaking concept, and we weren't the only ones going after it.
Yeah, and I don't think it's been fully realized. Even 20 some years on now, it's not. We've the narrative of Lloyd's digitizing itself like fully has yet to sort of come to fruition. So I think we're still on a bit of the journey there. And it's interesting as well because you started very much in the enterprise business to business space. I know with InsTech, you look at a lot of up and down the value chain. So a ton of consumer Insurtech stuff, but also this enterprise stuff. So we can dive into that as we move forward as well. But from that very first part of the project, it's very much, we've always sort of, the industry's always defined these things as platforms. Like what is the next platform, the digital platform that the industry will move towards? What are your thoughts on the challenges that we've had to date, and then sort of maybe the term platform as a terminology in general?
Well, I find I've had a little trouble with the word platform only because I think it's massively overused. And if you look at almost every technology provider, certainly Insurtech, they would use the word platform, and I don't think Supersede is immune from that. So I think it's slightly overused, and my definition is always much more about it being a sort of operating platform, a place where people can come and put sort of multiple applications. But it's very difficult to find the right terminology, and I think what RI3K was in the end a many-to-many platform. In other words, it was a marketplace in which many brokers could access many carriers, and I think that that's a really interesting space in which I know you guys have had a good long hard look at, and which is the aspiration for most people who come into this, that you'll be ultimately a transactional platform where people can come in, run through a process, click a button and buy their insurance, whether that be at a B2C level or a B2B level. Because we went for Lloyd's, it was obviously always a B2B thing. And the starting point for all these things back in 2000 was a digital replica of what existed in the physical world. I mean, we were literally making a place where a broker could do exactly what a broker was used to doing with an underwriter, but online as a digital experience rather than as a physical experience.
Yeah, no, certainly. I love the term you use there, many to many, when we think about the transition we're trying to achieve, because you could argue that Lloyd's in its ancient iteration is many to many because there's lots of different participants there, but that's not really what we mean here. I guess actually Lloyd's in its oldest iteration is kind of one-to-one because you have people queuing and waiting to go and visit an underwriter at a box, and each underwriter can only serve one broker at a time. And then, as we said, across consumer and business, gradually we saw one-to-many start to emerge where, on a single website, that website could service many different requests for the same thing simultaneously. And that platform, maybe the wrong word, nirvana, is where we've got many to many happening, where those requests are interfacing simultaneously across different providers and suppliers, and matching, I guess, what we've struggled to really define a lot of times in insurance, these buyers and sellers simultaneously operating. And you're never quite sure who's the buyer and who's the seller in commercial insurance, especially, that it's quite a challenge to get everybody playing online simultaneously.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about technology is it's forever evolving. So if you'd said to me 20 years ago, you'd be able to put a risk online, and then algorithmically you would be able to define which of the various underwriters at Lloyd's might be able to take that or would have appetite for it, and probably even the remaining capacity for it. That would have been very exciting. Originally, it was what we called carpet bombing. You just loaded up lots of underwriters and press send, and you knew in advance who you were going to send it to, because the people who used to walk it around. But bit by bit now, the technology, the many-to-many technology, gets very, very exciting, because it becomes so much more that you couldn't possibly replicate in the digital world. Plus, the quality. We had to build everything from scratch with RI3K. I mean, it sounds weird now, but there was no such thing as a document management system, or we got an Oracle database and were ruthlessly exploited by Oracle consultants, as it seems to me everybody was in the day. But everything else we had to build from scratch. And we even had to agree a process. I mean, it was in those days, there was no document you could go to that says this is the process at Lloyd's. And in fact, it was almost impossible to get everybody to agree to the same process in those early days. So we were quite pioneering from that point of view. And of course, a lot of the work's been done now to standardize process and, to a lesser extent, standardize data. And the more you get down that journey, the more the benefits accrue.
I have to ask you a question, actually. So in my own time in the Lloyd's strategy team, which would have been 2014, 15, 16, somewhere around then, we had a host of amazing role models to look at in all kinds of other industries. We'd be like, oh, what if Lloyd's became the eBay for risk, the Tinder for risk, whatever you wanted, Facebook for risk. What were you looking at in the early days of RI3K as, what if we had, your Lloyd's? What was the inspiration that you could draw upon there?
Well, I think it's a very nice question, in the sense that every other industry was moving from a physical market to a digital market, and therefore there were templates to borrow. But the ones that most people went for as examples was the International Petroleum Exchange or Commodities Exchange. But they were slightly different in the sense that they were known things. I mean, Brent crude has a price at any given moment in time, and then you can, whereas we were sending something that had absolutely no sort of pre-agreed price, or even enough structure to be able to go through that. And what everybody wanted was an exact replica of what they were doing before. I mean, to the extent where once we'd built it, we started to demo it, and an underwriter once said to me, "Where do I put a pencil line on the slip?" And I said, "Well, we have to have a digital process now. We can't have a concept of putting a pencil signature on something." They said, "Well, I can't, possibly use it then." So, we had to go back to the drawing board. That happened a lot. That sort of, you haven't exactly replicated what we were used to doing.
Yeah. For those who are less familiar, for listeners who are less familiar with the Lloyd's process, a penciled line is a very soft indication of what you're like. You've not put it on pen, you've not stamped it, but you're saying, I'm going to do this, but I can revoke this kind of without, and this is what you're trying to say is the digital version of that doesn't allow us to have this sort of soft indication, expression of interest category. And if you try to replicate everything, the UX becomes untenable. right? It's impossible to have like hundreds of options for all men because it doesn't lend itself very cleanly to just being a pure replica. But you made an interesting analogy to the oil trade, and I think the industry is often looked at pursuing kind of what the financial markets have done, but we've always seen challenges there because it doesn't. It's not a one-to-one. Those are different types of product. Pure commodities don't lend themselves very nicely at all to being how insurance risks will be traded. How have you sort of seen that sort of analogy go forward, and what do you sort of see the future look like if it's not a pure commodity and it's not an exact replica of human interaction but on computers? Where do you sort of see the end game in the next sort of 15, 20 years sort of landing?
I think we're at the beginning of the end game now, and what I mean by that is what can be algorithmically priced is starting to move up from simply houses, cars, and contents. And you look at the work of somebody like that Rethink are doing at Howden's with algorithmically or profiling risk so that they can work out where it might be auto priceable as a broker, or something like Fave, which is owned by Canopius, where that's quite complicated business. That's US high net worth business, but it's being auto priced. So where you have volume, certainly in the delegated underwriting space, I think that more and more that starts to become auto priceable or algorithmically priceable. But I also think that a good proportion of the total amount of business that goes through Lloyd's is never auto priceable. I mean, it might be as a portfolio, as a whole portfolio, it might be something that could be automated. But I see increasingly kind of triage system, both for brokers and for underwriters, where this you can just auto price. This might need a bit of manual intervention. This is manual the whole way because it's something that just has never been seen before, or just needs some brain to. But even that would be a massive advance on where we are now and make us a much more efficient marketplace to deal with.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the delegated authority business. I think oftentimes, to borrow an American expression, that's for everybody flinch there. The justification for this innovation has been hard for a lot of market practitioners to really get on board with. It's like, do we really have to go through digitization or digitalization? It's quite a big, arduous process for us when it's fine doing it face to face, etc. But there are a few areas where, for all sorts of cost reasons, especially, the market is having to cut back on business plans, and delegated authority is one we've seen in the news a lot recently, where Lloyd's have said, folks, you can't carry on writing this business with these huge acquisition and admin costs, where it's being touched so many times, where a tiny bit of it is being part of a portfolio, but actually you're getting more exceptions to your rules that have to be then re-underwritten each time, that none of this business is actually simple follow business. So it really does create a bit of real motivation to invest in these sorts of things. Whereas I think otherwise, as you said, it's sort of, we want to do exactly what we do now, but on a computer, and then we'll be digital. Hooray. But we do need a real reason, I think, to do these sorts of things.
Well, I think there are two areas where I get incredibly grumpy, and as you know, I can be grumpy, and they are spreadsheets as the basis of managing and moving data around in the delegated underwriting space. But there's simply no reason for it other than that it's a lowest common denominator transport mechanism. But they didn't tend to use the spreadsheets for what spreadsheets were invented for. They just happen to be a place where you can put something and send it to someone else and they can take a look at it. And the other thing is just the PDFs of documents.
Yeah.
Those are, in the modern era, so easily digitizable. And in many cases, they start digitized and then they get undigitized for the processes of transport again.
Yeah.
Some of this stuff is really, really difficult. But that neither of those are difficult, and that should have been done a long time ago.
And yeah, we agree. I think those seem like quite low hanging fruit, and it's this differentiation between documents and data, right? And you look at the really large firms who want to talk about how much data they have, and they've written, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of contracts, of which they have a handful of fields from each, which are data. And then they've got a mountain of documents that are sort of sit that they can't actually extract anything of value from. I think, the world that you're envisioning there is one where by default it's data centric, actually data driven, the underlying information, the entirety of the process that's being involved, the deal that's being done in its entirety is sort of data centric, which then in the sort of immediate term delivers sort of efficiency gains, but over time it begins to deliver some very powerful ability to interrogate that data, gather insights, plan for the future, change what you want to do as a strategy. Like, it really begins to unlock a lot. But right now it's sort of, oh, here is, we have a PDF which we can now extract 7 fields from. Okay, that's you've increased fragmentally the amount of information that you have, but you're still like document centric. And there will be a transition, I think, that you have there. But yeah, the spreadsheet reliance is painful.
I mean, there's 2 aspects to it. I think that we know we suffer from a kind of cultural issue, which is wedded to tradition wherever possible. But the other thing, which probably I learned, is the biggest thing I learned in the period that I was running i3K, or as it became Catalyst, was how incredibly difficult it is to get consensus on anything. Mm. And any model which by its nature, because we've called these many-to-many, needs many to agree on things, is in the industry in which we work fabulously difficult. There's no ability to corral people. If Aon think it's a good idea, Marsh won't. If the brokers like it, then the carriers won't. The ability to get people all in the same place, and by extension, if you then say, right, we'll never get this agreed, we're going to mandate something, or we're going to this is the way that we at i3K are going to do it, everyone goes up in arms and says, well, you never made the case, you never bought the hearts and minds. You lose either way. And I think more than anything else, the last 20 years has shown, through all the failures that we've had, that just getting everybody who needs to agree to something at the same time. Mm-hmm. The delegated underwriting is easily doable. It's just you can't get every party to the transaction to agree to do it, and therefore it stays where it is.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I remember, not quite as recently, but a few years ago we had the I Support Tom campaign, for the revamp BVL, and everything was orange, and you had posters everywhere, and that was very much the can we get the hearts and minds. And then more recently you had the B3i initiative that at least had direct investment and sponsorship from massive firms, and obviously that's not come to fruition either. So it's what have you got to do to get everybody on the same page, or as you said, maybe that's not the approach to take.
I thought that B3i thing was really interesting when you look at the Swiss Re comment on it. They and one, I'm not one of these people who goes, I told you so, because it seemed to be for the first time for a long time the industry actually put money into experimenting on something and learned. And we don't have this concept of quick fail. It wasn't particularly a quick fail, but a lot was learned. And the thing that was learned was almost what we're talking about, which is you need to have every party to the transaction on that same one technology. They were effectively trying to do something halfway through the transaction at the reinsurance phase, not having captured the data they needed to at the insurance phase. Yeah. And they took the view, which is, I think, rightly, that they would never be able to conjoin the two, so they gave up. But that's what we learned. Right? We learned that everyone's got to be in the game, otherwise it's very difficult to do this stuff.
Yeah, I think there's always complexity when you have that co-opetition kind model, if it's a word that we people still use these days. But there's certainly difficulty in when you need to align with certain changes, even something very small. So if a disagreement in lines of business or geography namings or whatever that might be, when you're especially working on a blockchain. But when you have to agree with what you're going to select going forward, there's always an imbalance, however small it may be, that one party is going to sacrifice more, even if it's they have to spend 10,000 more man hours or people hours upgrading their system to adapt to the other one. Like, there's always a little bit of a trade-off. So it's looking at it more of going, well, why should we have to make our internal system changes? You should do that instead. So people get really entrenched into what would be, if you're starting from scratch, no one would debate this. But if we were starting from a blank piece of paper, we could probably align on these things much more easily, much more quickly. But we're not. We're starting, as we talk about all the time, a deep mountain of legacy data and technologies. So the change required for all parties to align on a new model going forward is felt differently by different firms. And when you're doing that alongside a potential competitor, that feels more stressful. I don't want our team to spend hundreds of millions of more dollars upgrading, so we map to your systems. You should map to our systems version, and so that's sort of underlying a lot of this. And I think one of the reasons that these things can sort of really get sort of stuck is those sort of internal battles that you bump into.
I think the technical term for this kind of inertia is status quo loss aversion. So it's a really good Machiavellian quote that I've seen pop up a few times. It's something along the lines of the innovator will find no friends amongst anyone who's benefiting from the status quo.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
Yep.
No, that seems to be exactly what Insurtech has become, and it won't. Perhaps this era is already coming to an end, but it became the party that entered the equation to temporarily or permanently improve what was there before, because the establishment, the incumbent players, couldn't improve it themselves.
Yeah.
And that hasn't happened much in the London market necessarily. But if you look at something like embedded insurance, for instance, it's a world completely dominated by Insurtech, because Insurtech has the capacity to build the technology that sat between a distributor and an insurer. And the incumbent world, sitting mostly on legacy, couldn't possibly do it. So, and I think bit by bit, one world partners and or consumes the other. But that's exactly the role it seems to me that Insurtech has played. It's said, well, if you guys aren't going to do it, then there's an opportunity here, and we will step in.
Yeah.
I definitely remember reading InsTech London's various reports over time, where we started with that, wow, okay, look at the potential for disruption, and then seeing the way that the parties sort of coalesced, then maybe more collaboration and partnership was the way forwards. Are we still in a sort of optimistic or positive, bullish view of partnership for Insurtechs as the way forwards, do you think? Or how's that?
No, I think so, for sure. I mean, I think the days of what I call the bedsit-driven innovation are over, and there was lots of excitement about some 23-year-old from Imperial with a degree in data science who was going to show you how to insure your pets or something. I mean, I think that day's long gone. I think the companies to be taken seriously are those that the investment world is prepared to give serious amounts of money to, and on the whole, they're pretty good. They're pretty good judges. But if you look at what's happened to InsTech as a community, it was all about startups at the beginning, and we gave them a platform and a place where they could come and showcase what they were doing. But our membership now is likely to be NASDAQ or MasterCard or Salesforce or Stripe, as it is anybody else, and that's because the incumbent world sees the value in partnering and or acquiring and or learning from what's going on in that space. And it's there won't be as many unicorns as everybody imagined, because the partnership model will be the prevailing model, and it'll get absorbed either one way or another. It gets absorbed into the way the incumbent world works. But and that's why I think there's much talk about M&A these days, because the really good ones will, I'm sure, just get bought by the biggest insurance companies in the world if they become a threat, or they so patently are a place of opportunity.
Yeah. And speaking of reports and InsTech, there's been one quite interesting to this episode released quite recently. I wondered if you wanted to give us a sort of mini tour of your marketplaces and exchanges report, because we really enjoyed reading it, but our listeners might not have seen it yet. So what does it say and where can they find it?
You're very neatly done, and thank you. Yes, this is an area which, for the reasons you've touched on, was always fascinating me, and I've had 20 years of experience in it, and then every now and again I get sort of a passionate desire to tell everybody what's going on in my mind. And this is one of those. It wasn't driven by our membership particularly asking to write about it, but I could see for myself the moving of the tectonic plates, and we now have a very well-resourced research team, so writing these things becomes fundamentally easier. And the underlying thesis is that while we started out replicating the IPE, the ICE, or E-Lloyds to build a physical equivalent, I don't think now we will ever see a big utility type model. Back to the issues we've touched on. You can't get consensus. The establishment has proved itself not well equipped, to put it politely, to lead these things. And therefore, I think the next generation, partly fueled by Insurtech, is these lots of individual platforms, to use your word, that are solving different problems. Some of them solve a problem of giving you access to different sources of capacity. Some of them provide you with a niche area you can go and insure your crypto assets. There are now and lots of people who have very sensibly, to my view, said that big one looks beyond us. But if we pick off parts of the value chain, we become niche in just cargo, we can build a very interesting business with that. And that's the basis of the report. And we called it 10 ways in which marketplaces and exchanges are changing the nature of insurance, because each of those 10 categories are doing something new and solving an existing problem, of which, that's why we featured you guys, because you selected a problem to solve and you're solving it. And I'm sure when you are finished solving that, you'll go on and solve something else. That's what I like about this model, is it becomes highly doable, your original plan, and then those who are successful and can raise the money will go on from where they start to solve more and more of these problems.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on some of the historical challenges people have tried to or run into trying to do this. Is they try to do everything at once. It has to do all spectrums of insurance, and then reinsurance, and then maybe retro or ILS, and it just makes it impossible to service any one of them sufficiently well. But in this new framework, people can lean into the areas that work really, really well. If there's gaining traction across different, you might see little mergers similar to like a Lemonade Metro Mile in the US for like that kind of model. But also, if you look at other startups who are building like HR software or something, they might partner with a company that's done contracts or similar, because they're all sort of solving the niche that they're starting in and then bumping into adjacencies and seeing who else is having some success, who else has found the model that's working in those areas. And you see this sort of more organic kind of growth versus the historical model, which was, let's try to solve all of this at once, eat the elephant in one go, and then perpetually plagued with development delays and everything else, because they've tried to do so much at once, solve for every fringe use case at once, versus sort of just chipping away at a core problem and then seeing what happens as you gain traction there.
So many things become solvable now. I mean, a lot of the niche exchanges which only do one class are able to put 20 people around a table who are all they need to be able to access their entire market for that, not hundreds of people, and then to agree data standards, and then to agree far more easily what their next rollout will, so that they can make their exchange fundamentally more efficient, because they are able to align all the parties around more efficient ways of doing things, and agreeing sort of more standardization over time, which itself drives the efficiency. And that's what I like about it. It's just easier to achieve things. You can just go much faster, and at some point those exchanges become so much cheaper and quicker as a place to transact business that becomes a competitive advantage, and others have to say to themselves, what do we do now? Do we build one of those? Do we go and play on that one? But we can't while they're getting a quote in 5 seconds flat, and we're wandering something around the market, we're going to do something about this.
Yeah. I also think that you'll begin to bump into this self-fulfilling prophecy where the success and momentum of those marketplaces and those exchanges makes it easier for new entrants to join them. So if you think about historically, there's always been criticism of the willingness for executives in our industry to invest in these sorts of efforts, because it always felt like a huge multi-year project with a huge amount of upfront costs, et cetera. And no one wanted to put their sort of head up to do that. But these things gain momentum and they see other people in peer groups and they see that they can actually get up and running on that, even to a smaller degree, over the course of a few months versus multiple years, and the cost of joining those exchanges decreases, more and more will sort of go, we should do a bit of that, and that momentum accelerates, and then more companies see their competitors there as well. So now they're missing out. Ben's used the example before about at a certain scale, like Hilton has to be on hotels.com because no one's just going to go to their site if everyone starts their search here. That same behavior will happen in our industry, where you'll see this massive acceleration where people go, well, we need to figure out how we also play in this environment, because if we don't, it's going to be jeopardizing to our business and our growth potential.
I think to your earlier point, the challenge we have is that initial chicken and egg problem is so forceful that the negative network effects are almost ridiculously strong in our space compared to the positive network effects, because it tends to just take one party to be a pain. I think with B3i, for example, the brokers were not really invited at the beginning, and then eventually came on as kind of testing partners, and then went off and did their own sort of thing. It starts to fall down suddenly if you're missing key participants. And even had they taken part, yes, you had 20 major insurers and reinsurers, but what if you want to place a deal that's got other insurers that don't want to play ball? Suddenly, again, one Hilton, can ruin it, because you need not just one outcome from your many-to-many interactions. You actually need many as the result.
Yeah. Well, and that's further complexity added to that with sort of the consolidation at the top in our industry, the sort of how much control the few big players can have. And then to your earlier Machiavellian quote, it's sort of, if those firms benefit the most, which historically they have, because they're the biggest, from the status quo, they're oftentimes the least excited to sort of kick the wall down and tear up the playbook, because it's serving them very, very well right now. So you're trying to solve around all of these various things and build a business that sort of threads the needle, as they say. Do you guys use threads the needle as a saying? Oh, these are ones as I'm saying them going, oh, this might only resonate with the American audience. I don't.
Yeah.
Well, that's part of the reason I wrote the report, which is to highlight the fact that there are people who are doing things. In other words, I think the easiest thing to do is do nothing.
Yeah.
And at some point I made the observation that even after reading the report, most people still do nothing, because they're either protected because they're one of the big players who have leverage to enable them to sweat the existing model, or I think some will necessarily do some of the work which enables them to play in a kind of ecosystem world where they need to integrate to multiple parties. I think people have got to get their heads around that. But there are people who are saying, we can't go on like this any longer, we're going to build one ourselves, and some of that's innovation and entrepreneur driven, and some of it's actually been driven by the marketplace itself. And none of those people are looking to lock anybody out. In other words, they're building them with the view that once they've proven the model, others will be invited at any time, and that they will have governance and data protection models, which means that there's no possibility of there being any bad behavior in running of those exchanges. So I admire as I always have done, and this because in my DNA, I admire those who are saying, right, we can't carry on like this any longer. Let's build something, and I think almost all of them would welcome discussion with their competitors or with other markets at any time, because they haven't built it for themselves. They've built it as the answer to the market's problems.
Yeah, I remember concluding interestingly with this sort of, let's just do it ourselves, or we've got to get this done, so let's crack on with it. I remember one of the major conclusions of a report I did in my consulting days was, you've got to be omni-channel for now, at least until, if ever, this ultimate solution emerges. And I think of things like DocuSign, for example, as being quite creator-driven to some extent. So if somebody wants to get their document signed, they've got to choose how to do it. Yes, some of your signees might prefer that you used Hello Sign instead, but at the end of the day, if they want to sign the document, they're not going to ruin it for everyone else. You send it out as the creator, and hopefully everybody signs your document and it's done. And actually, then if another creator sat next to you decides to send something through HelloSign, all those participants are going to find a way to sign it via HelloSign as well. So I feel like if we can empower the creators, I think for us in Superseed, that's often the seedants and the brokers who are the deal makers, to just get a really good tool that they can use to get their individual deal done. Then if people want to be a part of that deal, then use the thing, and it's going to make their lives easier as well. And if there's another one, great. But yeah,
that's the biggest thing that's changed in the last 20 years. I said earlier we had to build everything from scratch. You can walk out now and talk to Microsoft or Amazon or Salesforce, and you can get just about everything you need. You better start configuring, but it's easy, at that point. It's easy to integrate with. It's easy to build a process. It's probably got some things in the front which will turn data into documents into data that you could spin up pre-existing technology. So not only have you got the creators and are encouraging the creators, but you can give them the tools, and that's the biggest difference. That's why there are so many platforms playing out there right now, because the toolkit's so good.
And Cordy gave us a challenge earlier before we got started recording.
He did.
I'm wondering if we should move on to that segment.
So as you probably know from listening to the podcast, we always like to have a few games that we play with guests, especially. This one is our analogy battle. As the chairman of InsTech, we wanted to sort of do, what is sort of your analogy for the Insurtech space? So something that describes Insurtech as a movement or an idea more generally. We'll have Ben kick it off and we'll see how we get on.
The warm-up act supporting. Here we go. I'm cheating slightly because I gave this at an Aon leadership offsite years ago. But basically, I compared Insurtech a while ago to veganism. Especially as we were going through this transition where most people are still not vegans in the world, but there are increasingly options made available that cater towards people who want to use vegan products for something. So you start to see it pop up more and more, most famously in the UK, the Greggs vegan sausage roll, and gradually McDonald's and Burger King and all the fast food chains realizing we've got to have a vegan option. And I see it quite similar to Insurtech in the sense that we haven't seen suddenly everything taken over and turned into vegan alternatives, and we now only use vegan. We're seeing little pockets make it available. We're seeing particular niches like fast food where it's where perhaps the supply chains were the most harrowing, replacing some of their meat ingredients with vegan options instead, where the economies of scale make sense, where it makes sense to invest, and where your value proposition isn't about how well you've reared your animals. It's a very similar environment and movement that's sort of gradually building momentum, but not necessarily kicking out the former status quo.
I like your multi-channel comparison too, where it's like you don't have to go all vegan, but you should have a couple things on your menu, right? It's this sort of transitional thing there. Do you want to go next then?
No, I can't beat that. I think that's...
He's got a strong lead.
I think that's a strong lead. But I would say this, that we organise dinners every couple of weeks, and it's fair to say that the event organiser does spend a lot of time having to deal with everybody's different food choices these days. And just the day when you could put a set menu in front of everybody is longer gone. If you have 20 people, you'll have to deal with a lot of different kinds of tastes and preferences in the world. Yeah, so I think it's as good as you're going to get from me.
The one that I came up with during the show was it's sort of cheating because it's looking at another industry being quite broadly impacted by technology, but that of travel, in the same kind of way of every trip might be a little bit different, just like risks are, and clients might have numerous different types of risks. And in certain cases, I want to get a fancy hotel and stay in a big city. In other cases, I want to find a yurt in the countryside, or I want to get some additional coverage, or I want to book an experience. And what historically would have been go to one person and hope that person at this high street storefront can solve all of my needs, whether that's insurance needs or whether that's planning a trip, has moved online, and the insurtech ecosystems that are emerging and evolving give you more options. You can break your policies up. You can get just certain things for different carriers for different needs, and you can be a bit more bespoke around, okay, well, I have this little thing I want to make sure I have coverage too, and there's someone else to sort of support that, however much that might be, slightly more niche or nuanced or similar. But it's parallels quite heavily to just technology in general.
No, but I think it's a very good one, because when you think the trips you've done recently and when you've traveled, it is rare, although some sites, will try to compel you to use just one, option for flights, hotel, and hire car. We rarely do, right? We actually tend to use multiple exchanges, and often with consumer stuff, it's more of like an aggregator type model. But we use one thing to find our flights, and then we switch to a completely different thing to find a hotel, or I used one for campsites as well. In the past, same for restaurants and so on. We might have all sorts of alternatives depending on what we're looking for at different times. So that idea, as I think we've all concluded, I think in this episode, that there's just going to be one great big thing and all the industry participants are going to collaborate to build it together, is maybe not only not the right thing for our industry, but not actually something that's tended to be the end result for any other industries or most other industries either.
Well, I think the underlying shared sort of features of both of those analogies is the benefit to the end consumer, right? If you were vegan a number of years ago, like, you could go to these 2 restaurants, and those 2 restaurants had one choice each, right? And you were quite confined to what you could have. And now it's sort of like you can go most places. There's numerous options everywhere you go. So the experience at the end is much better. If you think about it in an insurance angle, if I'm a broker and I have a client, and that client now has one of their large clients wants to have horses. I've never done bloodstock sort of insurance before. This mechanism now allows me to go to find the people who can help me with this risk, so that I can sort of better service my end client. Like, it's this sort of experience is improving in such a way that you're always able to sort of fill whatever sort of gaps you might have, or needs you might have, as whether it's as a consumer or as a business owner. I think that's the benefit of everyone down the chain. So we're getting there. I think the industry is moving along very, very nicely.
I was thinking about the supermarket analogy, to your point about not going to one place. That's patently not right. I mean, I do think there's a company we feature in the report called BoltTech. I do feel that that's a supermarket. I feel like you can go to the supermarket and you can buy a lot of things from the supermarket, whereas what you two are talking about, and I think, if in the analogy game, if I look at what InsTech is, it is like an old school marketplace. There's lots of shops, and you go and talk to you go and talk to the data shop, or you go and talk to the technology shop, or you go and talk to the API shop. It's like having lots of people doing crafts and inventing that you can go and talk to about what you might be able to buy to solve your problems. Or some of them will go on to create their own MGAs and their own possibly insurance companies from their market stall. But it still feels like there are lots of stalls rather than one big place to go.
I love that. The modern artisans.
Modern artisans, there we are.
Yeah, exactly.
I shall go home with my head held high.
You should. We'll certainly put a link in the notes, both to the most recent papers you've put out, as well as to your site, because you host, I still monthly, I think, the sort of events you hold in London. So listeners who are in London, who are interested in this space, which if you listen to our podcast, you probably are, would certainly recommend swinging by there, not only to say hi to me and Ben, but to say hi to you, Robin, and get to sort of experience what InsTech is doing in the London scene, which I think is fabulous.
If anyone wants to come, let me know, and we'll sort out a free ticket. Next one is 13th of September at the Steel Yard down by Cannon Street Station.
Wonderful. We'll promote this in front of that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Robin. So much
Thank you so much.
covered, so much that's opened up as well. We barely touched on APIs or open data and so on, but yeah, lots to get our minds fizzing until the next episode of the Reinsurance Podcast.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.